I basically got interested in the brain as a young girl. I was 5 years old, and I couldn't sleep one night. I realized that, for real, that one day I was going to die. Basically, I had like an existential crisis. And that really freaked me out. I stayed up all night, and I thought to myself, well, even if I don't have a body, can I still keep my own inner thoughts, my own inner consciousness? So in a way, I wanted kind of like my soul or my thoughts to exist even without a body. So the next day, I asked my father, Dad, where do my thoughts come from? Because I want to keep them when I die. And it's not the typical question of a 5-year-old. And he said, well, they come from your brain. And I was like, oh, great, how? I want to figure out how to keep them. And he's a physician, so he kind of had a medical worldview. And he said, well, we don't know exactly. And I said, well, what can I be when I grow up to figure that out? And he said, I don't know, I guess a psychiatrist? So that sort of became my big burning question. How does this 3-pound piece of matter, with these neurons firing and neurochemicals slushing around, create our subjective experience, everything we feel, everything, every thought we have, every emotion, from the moment we wake up till we go back into a deep, dreamless sleep? So, and it's a pretty complex piece of matter, right? So the basic unit of the brain is the neuron, and our brain is made up of about 86 to 100 billion neurons, and there's also different types of neurons as well. We won't get into all that detail, but the basic form of communication is through these synapses, where they send signals that then get turned into electrical impulses, and so they're sort of electrochemical signals. And these connections, each neuron has about 1,000 to 10,000 synapses or connections. So that means there are about 100 trillion connections in the human brain. That's more connections than there are stars in the Milky Way. So it's a pretty complex piece of matter. And you can kind of think of it like an information processing machine. But much of what goes on in the brain is happening outside of awareness, is happening unconsciously. We're only conscious of a very little bit of the processing that's happening in the brain. If we had to consciously process every bit of information that our brain was taking in throughout the day, it would be overwhelming. We wouldn't be able to function. So it's very adaptive that most of the functioning is relegated to the unconscious. And most of our decisions are made outside of awareness, and we often come up with these post hoc explanations about why we do things all the time, which are not necessarily the real reasons, but our brain is kind of like a meaning maker machine, and it creates meaning out of random acts or thoughts that we do. So I became really interested not only in the neural basis of consciousness, but also in the neural basis of all of these unconscious processes that are really the things that are kind of motivating our behaviors and our thoughts outside of awareness. And we can start to test the unconscious in the lab by either presenting stimuli that's either presented very quickly, where the person claims they didn't see anything, but the information did get into the brain, or it's presented in a very subtle form. So again, the person claims not to see the message, but it will go on to affect the person's behavior outside of their awareness. So here's an example of a stimuli that we use in the lab. So raise your hand if you can see this subliminal message here. One man over there. I know what you're thinking. Sorry, I don't mean to point you out. No, that's it? Another? Okay. Like sheepishly. Okay, I'll point it out to you. In the negative space by the roots, it says S-E-X. Those of you who got it right away. You see? And then you can see there's birds and the bees, and the flowers are kind of loving towards each other. Right? Now, once you see it, you can't unsee it. Something changed in your brain, right? Because the stimulus itself, right, the photons hitting your retina being processed by the visual cortex remain the same. The physical stimulus remained constant, but what changed was your perception, was in your mind's eye. And that's what you want to track. What changed in your brain from when it was being processed unconsciously until when it popped up into consciousness, because the stimuli remained conscious. And again, even before you actually saw the word, you would have been primed towards maybe responding faster toward sexual stimuli or something of that nature. So it will go on. Your brain is processing the information even when you're not aware of it. And these kind of subtle signals are in our environment all the time. We're being bombarded by it, especially if you're in a big city like New York. There's information coming in all the time that's affecting our decisions and our behavior. I recently came across this cover of Parents magazine. I don't know if you guys saw this. It went to the stands. So Parents magazine takes people a minute to, yeah, I don't know what this message was conveying, but it went to press. Nobody picked up on it. There you have it. And so we can, again, manipulate people with these kinds of experiments. For example, in this study, actually, they gave people, very quickly, they would either present the image of the bad boy throwing a cake or a good boy presenting a cake. But it would be subliminal, so the people claimed not to see either image. And then they were shown superliminally or consciously the neutral boy. And they were just asked to describe him with personality traits. And sure enough, the people who were unconsciously exposed to the bad boy were more likely to describe him with negative traits. And if they saw the good boy, they were more likely to describe him with positive traits. There's, for example, another study where people had to learn word pairs, a whole bunch of word pairs like ocean, moon. And then later they were given sort of a free choice, a question. Say, name any detergent you'd like. Well, if they had heard the word pair ocean, moon, they were much more likely to say Tide as the name of a detergent. Or if you're in a competitive game with someone and they would either have a briefcase in their view or a backpack. People will behave more competitively if they see a briefcase versus the backpack. So little cues in our environment are sort of giving us information about how to behave. And it's also in the olfactory realm. So they once gave this study where they had people do a random task, but the real study was at the end of it, they would give them cookies, and then they either had no scent or like a lemon cleaner scent in the air. And sure enough, with the lemon cleaner scent, people were more likely to clean up the crumbs of their cookies. For those of you trying to get people to clean up at home, that's a tip. You should hear what I whisper in my husband's ear at night when he's sleeping. That's a side note. And it's also in the tactile realm. So they did another study where they had a graduate student walking the subject to the lab to go do the test. But the real test is they would say, oh, I'm holding a bunch of books. Can you hold my coffee for me? So the subject would either hold a hot cup of coffee or a cold cup of coffee. And then they go to the lab, and then they had to read an essay like about a person that was described in a very neutral way. And then they were asked to describe this person in adjectives. If they had held the warm cup of coffee, they were more likely to say the person was like warm and friendly. And if they had held the cold cup of coffee, they're more likely to say they were like cold and distant. So it's getting in through all of our senses, this information, affecting our judgments and our evaluations. Here's another subliminal image I want to test you guys on. So raise your hand if you can see this message here. Oh, a lot of you. Oh, great. Oh, okay. Oh, that was easy. Good. Okay, so you guys all saw the 9 dolphins in the negative space here? You see the dolphins? Wait, what did you guys see? That interesting. So what we learned here, which is interesting, is that prepubescent people, or as we call them children, they will tend to just see the 9 dolphins. And then adults tend to see, the naked man embracing the naked woman. So again, it's the same exact image, but we interpret it differently depending on what we've been exposed to. So how we perceive the world is context dependent, right? Our perception is built in on our expectations, what we're expecting, and we can be fooled, right? So there are all these visual illusions where our brain plays tricks on us. Here's an example of one where if you look at square A and B, they look as if they're different shades of gray, right? But in reality, they are exactly the same shade of gray. I know it's hard, even when you know it's true, to see it. This is called the shadow illusion because there's a shadow here, and B is surrounded by dark squares, and A is surrounded by light squares. Your brain kind of plays this trick. But if I remove that and draw a line, you can see actually they are exactly the same shade. So we have to question our reality, right? Our brain is constructing our perceptions that don't necessarily correlate. Here's another example of, do you remember this dress phenomena? I don't know if you remember that. It was in the news a while ago where people saw this dress, and some people swore it was blue and black, and others said it was white and gold. And it's because the sun was shining on the dress. It was ambiguous, and some people's brains darkened it up and made it blue and black, and others lightened it up and made it white and gold. And we also can use these bistable images in the lab where, for example, I can prime you with words like wise or elderly, and you'll likely see this older woman with that's her nose, her mouth, her chin, and her eye, right? Or I could say, youthful or young, and you'll see this young woman looking away. That's her eyelash, her nose, her chin, and her ear, right? And you'll never see them both at the same time. They switch back and forth in your mind's eye, right? It's like competing perceptions. And what we do is we want to track what's happening in the brain. For example, when you see the old lady versus when you don't. What's changing in your perception? Because we want to track the neural correlates of conscious perception. And one more that I'm just going to show you as an example. I don't know if it'll work in this room because you really have to do it when you're just sitting in front of a screen in a lab, but we'll try it. If you can kind of fixate your eyes to this X right here, if you can. I mean, it might not work for the people on the edges of the room here, but what happens to the yellow dots? Are you getting this effect? It's called motion-induced blindness. Do they disappear? So it might, depending on the angle you're at, but it's really striking for those of you. Raise your hand if you see them disappearing. Right? It's amazing. Now there's these bright yellow dots sitting right there in your face, yet they're disappearing in your mind's eye, and that's because the motion, your brain is tracking the motion, and it has this effect where they disappear out of your perception momentarily. And again, we want to track what's happening in your brain when you see them versus when you don't, when they're just sitting right there in front of you the whole time. So there's a number of different theories about what is happening in the brain when you're perceiving something. So I'm going to go through them one by one. No, I'm not going to go through all these theories, don't worry. Just kidding. This is a fun class today. But this is just to give you an example of there's a lot out there, okay? I'm just going to talk about a couple of ones that have a lot of evidence to support them. And one is the idea that what happens when you perceive something are these groups of neurons within your brain start firing together. If you can think of it like it's a coalition, or it's like a Darwinian competition in your brain between groups of neurons that come into power. And occasionally one group of neurons comes into power, it stays there for a few seconds, and that's what's in your consciousness. If you attend to something, you can keep it there longer until the next group of neurons comes into power and the other one dies out. Or it's kind of like an election where different parties are coming into power. And that's kind of the ebb and flow of conscious perception. But I liken this to, these are not neurons, this is a Twitter feed. But if you think about it, I think a great analogy is that if each tweet is like a neuron firing, when enough people start tweeting about something, it starts to kind of trend in our global consciousness. And that's kind of what's happening on a different scale in our brain. But it's important to remember that it's not happening, they're not all firing all at once. And they are doing it across these distributed networks in the brain. So it's not all like they're coming together in one place in the brain and you're kind of viewing consciousness. It's when all these different neurons in different areas of the brain start firing in sync, and not at the same time. That would be like an epileptic seizure. When I mean in sync, it's like if you think of each neuron as like a player in an orchestra, and when they're not all playing the same note, but it's not all in the beginning when they're all warming up randomly, but when they're playing a symphony together, that's kind of what it's like when they come together. Or you can think of it like a wave in a crowd. If each person is a neuron, they're not all standing up and sitting down at the same time. Again, that would be like an epileptic seizure, but in coordination, in sync, and that's what brings these coalitions of neurons together, and they come in and out of consciousness. Now, looking at the brain globally, related to this theory is this, what's called the global neuronal workspace theory of consciousness. It's a long term for, basically, it's saying that anything that you perceive in any given moment is when something gets broadcast globally and on a large scale, it kind of takes off in this global workspace, these assemblies of neurons. So if you think of it like this, when you were looking at the sex image before you saw it, it was activating the back of your brain, the primary visual cortex. So this is a side view of the brain, like if I'm looking this way, these are where your eyes would be. So the back of your brain, the primary visual cortex, was being activated, but you weren't conscious of it. As the information comes more into consciousness, you start activating these secondary visual cortices, like going forward in the brain, the temporal lobe, until finally you hit the prefrontal cortex in the front of the brain, and you get these feedback loops to the back of the brain, and that's when it comes into conscious perception. So that's one theory of consciousness. You kind of has to catch on in the brain, so to speak, for it to come to perception. And one other popular theory that I'll touch upon is something called the integrated information theory of consciousness. And this is the one that's a little bit out there, because basically it says that any system, it's like a property of the universe, any system that happens to have a high degree of integrated information and also differentiated, integrated information will have the property of consciousness. And the brain just happens to be one of those systems. And when I say integrated, I mean, like if a pixel on your phone goes out, it's not going to affect the pixel next to it. That's not integrated, right? But like if a neuron fires, it will affect a neuron next to it. That's an integration of information. So the idea, they even have a mathematical calculation for this, how integrated is this system, and they can measure it, and they call this measure phi. So the idea is that the system, you're conscious to the degree of phi that you have. It's like a number of amount of integrated information. So it's also a panpsychic theory, because it says any kind of matter can have it. It doesn't just have to be in the brain. It's a pretty controversial theory, but it's gotten a lot of popularity in the field. So, okay, that's all I have to say about what's the neural basis of consciousness. But if you recall, I said the thing that's really most interesting is all of those unconscious processes that are affecting our behavior. And of course, Freud was the father of the unconscious. Now, I don't think everything that Freud had to say was necessarily right, but I do think that he was on to some things. And basically, with modern neuroscience, we can glean back and look at some of the theories that Freud had with our modern technology and see which ones actually are true to this day with given what we understand about the brain. And it's also important to keep in mind that Freud was a neuroscientist. So he actually, this was his sketch of the neural basis of repression. He felt like you had this activation from one neuron to the next, and then you had this side cathexis where it would get sort of sidetracked down this other path and get relegated to the unconscious. So he was thinking about how are his theories instantiated in the brain? But he just didn't have the tools to really look at it at that point in time. So of course he came up with this idea of we have consciousness is the tip of the iceberg. Then you have what's called pre-conscious, which is not conscious in your minds at this given moment, but you can easily recall it. Like if I say, what did you have for breakfast this morning? You can grab it and pull it into consciousness. But then you have the deep, dark unconscious here, where the id lives. And that is much, you can't recall those things. They're affecting your behavior, but a lot of the time, it's very hard to reach in and grab that information and bring it into consciousness. And if you try to map on these ideas onto the brain, you can look at it kind of like this. And this is, again, a very rough sketch. But if you look at these subcortical areas here in red, the striatum, which is kind of a reward system in the brain, the amygdala, which has to do with our emotions, those are subcortical. Under you have the outer layer, which is the cortex, and you go deeper, and you can kind of think of it like our older reptilian brain. And they're sensitive to immediate pleasure or avoidance of pain, right? Freud would call it like our id impulses. I want that piece of chocolate cake right now. I'm just going to go for it. Animalistic desires, pushing you forward or repelling you away from punishment. Then you have these areas here in blue, the more recently evolved prefrontal cortex. And humans actually have the largest percentage of prefrontal cortex compared to the rest of the cortex than any other species. And it kind of thinks about the future consequences of your actions. It weighs in on the decisions. Okay, I might want that pleasurable thing right now, this moment, that piece of chocolate cake, but I'm on a diet and I want to look good in that bikini for this vacation, so I'm not going to have it right now, right? And so these two systems, and Freud might call this your superego, right? So you have these id impulses and you have the superego balancing them, and these two systems have a lot of connections between them. And when they're working well and in balance, we usually make pretty adaptive decisions, based on the context we're in and the social environment. You can't just act out and do whatever you want. That wouldn't be socially appropriate, all of those things. However, when I see patients with impulse control problems, they have a number of different types of problems. Either they have too much activation of these subcortical areas, so there's too much of this kind of, think of it like the accelerator and the prefrontal cortex is the brake. So they have over-acceleration, which is overriding the brake system, or there's either damage or underactivation of this brake system. So they have the impulse and they don't have the capacity to control the impulse. And then finally, you can actually have problems in the connectivity between these two systems. And you get a variety of other different types of problems, or inability to control your emotions, right? Because this also is a system that has to do with not just behavioral regulation, but emotional regulation as well. And we can see, the other thing I wanted to say here is that if you actually go in and directly stimulate some of the fibers in that reward system, in that subcortical reward system, you can implant electrodes, let's say in a rat, and they can press a lever to self-stimulate, to directly stimulate that reward network in the brain. And they have a choice. They can either press the lever to stimulate or to get food if they're food deprived, water if they're water deprived. They will choose to self-stimulate above anything, to the point of exhaustion, even to the point of death. So it's a really powerful drive. And it's also the circuits that's involved in drugs of addiction and also behavioral addictions, like people who can't stop gambling and those kinds of things. We also can see that if you put someone in the scanner and look at blood flow to different parts of the brain, and you have them simply imagine a neutral scene or imagine an aggressive scenario, you compare the activation in these two conditions. And when they imagine an aggressive scenario, you actually get decreased activation here in a part of the prefrontal cortex. It's called the orbital prefrontal cortex. But the prefrontal cortex activation goes down when people are less inhibited, when they're thinking about aggression, even just thinking about it. And then we have actually clinical cases. This is the famous case of Phineas Gage, where basically in the 1800s he was working on a railroad. He had this metal tamping iron bar, and then he sparked a bit of the dynamite. It shot straight through his prefrontal cortex. And his memory stayed intact, his intellect stayed intact. The thing that changed was his personality. So he became from this mild-mannered man to becoming verbally aggressive, impulsive, abusive. So that was the foundation of the idea that the prefrontal cortex is really key in impulse control and in our personality. So the reason I get really more interested in clinical cases is because, I want to understand how brains work. But one way that we can understand that is when things go wrong in the brain, right? Like if everything's working in your car right, you're not really thinking about, how does it work? But when something goes wrong, then you can sort of understand a bit more of how the system works. So that's why I started looking at clinical populations, at psychiatric patients and neurological patients, because that could help us understand more about the brain when everything is working properly. Now, Phineas Gage is an interesting case, and this is another case of a more sort of a modern Phineas Gage, where this is a man, and he was in his mid-40s, and he started developing kind of pedophilia symptoms, which is rare to first sort of see that someone at that stage in life. And they had to remove him from his home. He was living with a young stepdaughter, and they were going to put him in jail. And then he started getting these severe headaches. And then they did an MRI, and sure enough, they found this huge tumor right here in his right orbital prefrontal cortex. And they removed the tumor, and all of his symptoms went away, and he was allowed to return home. And about a year later, his symptoms started to come back again, and sure enough, the tumor had grown back. So, a lot of neuroscience with using fMRI, looking at neuroimaging, is about correlation, showing that certain brain regions are active during certain thoughts and behaviors. But this is going from correlation to actually causation, right? Brain changes directly causing changes in personality and behavior. And it brings up a lot of questions, and I'll touch upon a bit about free will, what does that mean, personal responsibility, and then also legal and ethical questions as well, right? How much control do we really have over our behavior if we are our brains? And so those are brain lesion patients that I study with prefrontal cortex lesions. Another type of patient that also has impulse control is a psychiatric patient. In particular, borderline personality disorder. So I look at, like, these are some examples from films. Glenn Close in Fatal Attraction was a classic example, but they often have instability in their self-image and their relationships. They can't control their emotions. They're impulsive and reckless. They often do things like reckless spending or sexual behavior or substance abuse. And what I did in some of my research is actually directly compared people with borderline personality disorder, because there's no clear lesion in the brain. With the neurological lesion patients, you can say, there's the tumor, or there's where the damage is. But in a psychiatric patient, it's much more subtle. There's a lot going on. There's neurochemical imbalances. So I took these borderline patients and compared them to people who had precise prefrontal cortex lesions, and found that they had very similar behavior, and on a variety of measures that had to do with impulse control and emotional dysregulation. And so basically what we found is that their behavior is being driven, particularly their impulsive behavior, by problems they're having in their prefrontal cortex, particularly the orbital prefrontal cortex. And this was novel at the time, to compare psychiatric patients to neurological lesion patients. And what it did is it tells us that in terms of treating psychiatric illness, it's not enough to just say, I'm going to treat this illness, borderline personality disorder or depression. But it's about looking at the individual symptoms, understanding the underlying neural circuitry of those symptoms, and treating that versus the disorder as a whole. Because they're very heterogeneous categories, meaning a lot of people can be labeled, let's say, borderline, but they can have a variety of different constellation of symptoms. Maybe somebody has a lot of impulsivity, but they don't have the emotional dysregulation. Or people with depression, there are different types of depression. So it's not like one treatment fits all. So it's about individualized treatment, looking at underlying brain circuitry and treating those symptoms rather than the overarching disorder. Now, we can also look at what's happening in the brain that's driving these behaviors, again, at the unconscious level. So this is a study that looked at subliminal motivation. Things were being motivated for outside of awareness. And it was a very simple task. They put people in the fMRI looking at blood flow, different parts of the brain in real time, and they showed them either a pound, this was done in the UK, or a penny. The pound being worth more than the penny. And they had this grip that they could grip, and the stronger they grip it, the more of the money they could win. So sure enough, when they saw the pound, they squeezed harder because they were more motivated than when they saw the penny. But on some trials, they presented them subliminally at 17 or 50 milliseconds. The person claimed they couldn't see anything. It was masked on either side, so all they saw was this mishmash. But they were still told, just still press the lever even if you can't see anything. And they did. And sure enough, they squeezed harder for the unconsciously presented pound than the unconsciously presented penny. So something was getting in. And when they looked at brain activation, they found that there was this kind of bottom-up decision-making process. So whether the money was presented superliminally or consciously or subliminally, it still activated a part of the basal ganglia, the ventral striatum, which is this reward system, that reward center in the brain that I talked about, is getting activated when they're seeing the money consciously or not. And then only later do the more conscious parts of the brain, like the prefrontal cortex, become aware of it. So the point of this is that we are being motivated and making decisions based on things that are happening outside of awareness. And there's other studies which look at the same kind of neural processes as well. This is just one example. Now, that being said, so we know that Freud was onto something with the unconscious. The unconscious can motivate us in certain directions, but what about these ideas that he talked about, like suppression and repression and dissociation? Is there a neural basis to that? Well, neuroscience is starting to understand the neural mechanisms of these psychoanalytic defense mechanisms. There's a whole field now called neuropsychoanalysis that's using neuroscience to look at some concepts in psychoanalytic theory. And this is one study that actually looked at the neural basis of suppression. So what they did is they told people to study, to learn these word pairs. So there'd be like ocean roach or steam train or jaw gum. And then they had to they were in the scanner, they put in the scanner, fMRI, look at brain activation, and they were told then in this phase to they were given the word ordeal, and they were in the think phase, they were told to think of the word that goes with the ordeal, which is roach. But then there was a no think condition where they were told, don't think of the word that goes with the ordeal. Now you might be thinking like that's like what we call the white bear phenomenon, right? If I say don't think of a white bear, that's like the first thing you're going to think of. But they got around that because they didn't say don't think of the word roach. They said don't think of the word that goes with ordeal. And because there was that extra step, people were able to do it. They were able to not think about the word and suppress it. And then there was just a condition where they did nothing, like a baseline. And then after this, they tested them for their memory of the words. Now they were said, okay, we want you to remember the word that goes with ordeal. And what they found is that in the respond condition, when those who were told, yeah, think of the word that goes with it, they could actually think of the word. But when they were presented with the suppressed condition, their memory for the word roach was actually worse. So it worked. Like suppression actually kept that memory outside of awareness, behaviorally. And then when you look at what happens in the brain, what they found is that during those suppression conditions, there was actually a neural mechanism behind that. When they're suppressing, you get increased activation in these areas in orange and yellow in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. Again, another part of the prefrontal cortex. And you get decreased activation bilaterally in the hippocampus, which is the memory part of the brain. So it's an active process, suppression, where you're actively using your prefrontal cortex to downregulate, to suppress activation in your memory areas of the brain to keep a memory at bay, to suppress it. You also see studies the same kind of mechanism with emotion. When people are suppressing emotions or told to suppress certain emotions, you get activation in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and then decreased activation in the amygdala, which is a part of the brain that has to do with emotion. So we're looking and seeing what the neural mechanism is of suppression. Now, there's another kind of defense mechanism called dissociation, right? And dissociation is basically, it occurs when psychological processes that are normally integrated become segregated out. So if you can think of suppression as like you're pushing a memory or an emotion down into the unconscious, dissociation is kind of like you're separating it out into another compartment where you don't have access to it anymore. And we all dissociate to some degree. It's normal to, like when you get, I don't know, engrossed in a book and you lose your sense of time and place and self, or if you're driving and all of a sudden you end up at your destination and you can't remember how you got there, right? You just become lost in thought. So self-driving cars have actually been around for quite some time now. But you know, it's an adaptive defense mechanism against trauma, right? Because if you can separate out disturbing memories and emotions from your daily experience, you can function. If you had a traumatic event and you're constantly reliving it all the time, you're not going to be able to adapt to your current circumstances. But sometimes people in these extreme cases, they get these dissociative disorders where they can't, like it's okay to separate out a little bit, where they can't get back. They can't get back, they can't reintegrate. So one of the most extreme cases is what's called dissociative identity disorder. It used to be called multiple personality disorder, but they decided instead of it being that you split off into different personalities, it's actually that you have this one identity that's been fragmented out and it's been dissociated. So the whole idea is to reintegrate those fragments back into this one identity. So they renamed it dissociative identity disorder. But basically with this disorder, you have at least one, you have a traumatic identity state where you have access when you're in that state to all of the traumatic memories and emotions that are disturbing. And then you have at least one, and maybe more than one, what's called a neutral identity state, where you have selective amnesia for the traumatic memories. So when you're in that state, you don't claim these things happened to you. And a lot of these reports of people with dissociative identity disorder were met with skepticism in the psychological community. And some people thought that they were faking the disorder because it just seemed so unbelievable. But now with neuroscience, we actually can confirm that it's a real phenomena with a physical basis that really can't be faked at the neural level. So one of the first studies, which looked at people with dissociative identity disorder, and it looks like a very complicated slide, but I'll break it down. Basically, they looked at, instead of function in the brain, you can just look at what structure in the brain. They did a structural analysis with MRI. And what they found is that they compared healthy people to people who had dissociative identity disorder, and people with DID had significantly smaller hippocampi. So the hippocampus, again, involved with memory. It's these areas, these lines here in red, and significantly smaller amygdala. So again, these are the parts of the brain that have to do with emotion and memory. And now, why they have these, so there's structural differences in the brain of these people. Why is another question. It could be that when you're exposed to stress at an early age, it releases all this cortisol. And cortisol directly affects the development of the hippocampus, hippocampal development. So if you have early life stressors, it could make your hippocampus smaller. The mechanism for the amygdala, why that's smaller, is less clear. Or it could be that you're born, there are genetic differences with smaller hippocampi and amygdalae, and so that maybe having a larger ones is a protective factor against trauma. So the larger hippocampus, larger amygdala, the more you're resilient to traumatic experiences. But we just don't know what came first. We just know that when you look at them as adults, there are these structural differences. And they also have differences in amazing physiologic variables. So some of them will have an allergic reaction to something when they're in one identity state and not the other, which just seems crazy, right? How do you control that? Some of them will have differences in autonomic variables like heart rate when they're in one state and the other. This is a state in which this one patient said she was blind in one state and not in the other, which just seems ridiculous, right? How can you be blind? And so, try to keep your eyes open and not see. It's very difficult to do, if not impossible. But this person claimed that. And when they did all these tests and looking at her optics, she looked as if she wasn't seeing when she was in the one state. So then what they did is they looked at EEG. They looked at brain activation in the primary visual cortex, that part right in the back of the brain. And they showed her a flashing checkerboard image. And what they found is that when she was in the sighted identity state, she had direct activation in the occipital lobe, in the primary visual cortex, that corresponded with the flashing checkerboard image. But when she was in the blind state, you can see it's almost like flatline. Her visual cortex, her eyes were open, she was looking at it, but the visual cortex was not responding to that visual stimuli. So in a sense, she was blind. She was able to suppress that visual information. That means that she had to suppress that information very early on in the kind of chain of processing in the brain. That means the information gets to your retina, then it goes to a place called the thalamus, it's specifically the lateral geniculate nucleus, and then it goes to the primary visual cortex. And she's somehow suppressing it at that thalamic level, which is really hard to explain. So of course, I wanted to get her in my lab and do a bunch of tests on her, but she was in therapy, and fortunate for her, but not for me, she got better. She integrated her identities, and everything all was well with the world. But I didn't get her in the lab. But what we know is that what appears to be happening with people with dissociative identity disorder is that there's a problem with the degree of interactivity, of connectivity between brain areas and between psychological functions. But what this patient does show is that it's actually possible, to recover, that the brain has this neuroplasticity. And because many conditions do respond, if not, I'm not saying that they're necessarily all cured, but have some response to therapy. And it tells us that we're malleable, right? That changing our thoughts and changing our behaviors can actually change the brain and ultimately change who we are. This other one, just to say one more thing about the DID patient, this was a really interesting study looking at the physiological variables. So what they did with these patients they were trained to be able to switch between one identity and the other. They would tell the therapist a story, their traumatic story, and when they were in their traumatic identity state, when they can remember it, and they would claim it happened to them. And then they would tell the therapist a neutral memory that they would claim happened to them in either identity state. Then the therapist got them in the scanner and read them either the neutral memory or the traumatic memory when they were either in their traumatic identity state, when they had access to that information, or in the neutral state. So there were 4 conditions. I'll break it down like this. You can see it here. And then they looked at heart rate and a bunch of different variables. So when they were read the neutral memory script, which is here, And so the dotted line is their neutral identity state when they don't have access to traumatic memories, and the solid line is their traumatic identity state when they do have access. So the neutral memory script, they had similar heart rate frequency when they were read it in either condition. But when they were read the traumatic memory script, you can see in their neutral identity state, they don't have a reaction to it. But when they're in their traumatic identity state and they believe it happened to them, they do have a reaction. The same thing with blood pressure. There's this dissociation. When they're read the traumatic memory script, neutral identity state, no change in blood pressure, traumatic, there is. In all these different variables, you can see that they're having different physiologic responses to the memory. So when they're in that neutral identity state, they really are able to keep that information at bay. They don't even have a physiologic response to it. And when you look at what's happening in their brain, you can see that when they're in that neutral identity state, when they're keeping it at bay, actually they have more brain activation. All these areas in red are what's more active when they're in that neutral identity state, which means it takes energy, it takes effort, mental effort to keep that information at bay. They particularly have a lot of activation in the prefrontal cortex. That system that I was talking about, how you activate the prefrontal cortex to suppress the subcortical information. And this might be one reason why certain types of therapy work to help recover information that's suppressed, because anything you can do that decreases that activation of the prefrontal cortex to stop that mechanism that's constantly trying to keep it at bay can allow the information to come to the surface. So that's why things like sort of hypnosis work, or, Freud had it right a bit when he was talking about dreams, because when you're dreaming, you actually have decreased activation of the prefrontal cortex. So you're not suppressing anymore, and it allows a lot of the things that are in the unconscious to come to the surface. Anything you can do to decrease, sometimes, alcohol can do it, where you decrease that activation, allows the unconscious to come to the surface. That's why they say, like, in vino veritas, right? In wine there is truth. And then finally, what about repression? Now this is confusing because this technique is called continuous flash suppression, but it's a technique that's used to look at repression. Now the repression is really hard to study in the lab because suppression is when you voluntarily, actively push something into the unconscious. So like you have a fight with your significant other, but you're like, I have to go to work today, it's gonna distract me, I'm not gonna think about it, I'm gonna push it away, right? You're consciously doing that, relegating it to the unconscious. But repression happens automatically outside of awareness. You don't have control over that, okay? So how do we study it in the lab? Well, you have to come up with these novel, unique ways in which to do it. One way is that was interesting is they use this technique called continuous flash suppression. I'll play it again, where they have these flashing Mondrian images. So they had a machine where in one eye, for example, you see an angry face. In the other eye, you see this flashing image. But you remember like that bistable image, you never see both at once, you see one or the other? This is called continuous flash suppression. And so here, because that flashing image is so salient, all the person claims to perceive is the flashing image. Even though in their left eye, you get this really salient, evolutionarily speaking, angry face, but the flashing image suppresses it. So it's a great technique we can use because we can present something to a person right there in front of their face while they're fully awake and conscious, and they claim not to see it, but it gets in. So using this technique, this study looked at how much attention do people pay to invisible, naked images, right? Really salient images. So what they did was they had this continuous flash suppression technique, and then they'd either show a naked man or a woman to either the left or the right visual field. And the opposite eye would just be a scrambled image. Now, all the person claims to see is this Mondrian image here. So they'll basically either going to see a naked woman in their left or their right visual field, and a naked man in their right or left visual field. And this test was given to both men and women. And then, the last part of this, is what they do is after they're tested with this little, what's called a Gabor patch. It's a little patch with little lines, and they're slightly tilted to the left or the right. And all the person has to do is say which way are they tilted, left or right, and what we time them. So the point is, if they were paying attention to, let's say, the left visual field unconsciously, they're going to be quicker on this task if it's presented to the left than the right. So basically, you're looking at reaction times to see where a person was unconsciously attending to. And what they find is that heterosexual men were unconsciously attending significantly more to wherever the naked woman was presented. unconsciously. So all they claim to see is, the Mondrian images, but they were quicker to respond to where there was previously an unconscious naked woman. And then heterosexual women were unconsciously attending to the naked men. Interestingly, homosexual men responded like heterosexual women in that they unconsciously attended more to the naked men. What was really, and then for women, this is the interesting part, I think, even more interesting. Women, when there was other naked women, it was pretty much neutral. But men, when they're heterosexual men, when they were presented unconsciously with naked men, looked away. They actually diverted their attention. Their reaction times were slower. Now, I would call this, or Freud might call this, repression of homosexual desires. But this is one way that we can actually look at repression in the lab, because this is unconsciously delegating attention away from something, right? I just point this out because there are ways to study things, even like repression, in the lab, but you have to be kind of tricky about it. So finally, what does this tell us about free will, right? How much control do we have over ourselves and over our behavior if, given everything I've told you so far about the brain? And according to the classic definition, the sort of Cartesian definition of free will, which says that free will means that if everything was exactly the same and the conditions were all the same, meaning everything in the environment was the same, the temperature in the air, everything you've eaten that morning, and every neuron was firing in exactly the same way, you could have done otherwise, right? And according to studies in neuroscience, that's just not the case. Theoretically, if I knew everything that was happening under that condition and I set up the same exact conditions, you would behave the same exact way. To assume that there's something else means there's a ghost in the machine, right? Then there's like some other magical energy, spirit, whatever you want to call it, that's shifting you in one direction or the other. And this is all kind of, there's a whole series of experiments in neuroscience which look at this, but the classic one started, it was in the 1980s by Benjamin Libet, where basically he just looked at brain activation. And he said to a person, just whenever you feel the urge, whenever you want, press this lever, right? And then he said, just look at where that little ball was going around the clock, right? I don't know if it's moving. There. Just remember where it was on the clock when you first got the intention to move, because the move itself takes time, right? And that's going to waste some time. And then verbalizing it takes time. So just remember the moment you had the intention, where that little ball was, and then he looks at brain activation. And what he found is that, so you have this point which is called your moment of your awareness of your intention, like I am going to move my arm now. And then you have the actual action that happens a few milliseconds later. But what he saw is there was actually a buildup, this is brain activation, a buildup in brain activation up until the point when you become aware that you want to make the move, and then you make the move. But that readiness potential is what he called it, is happening outside of awareness. So basically your brain is gearing up, and then all of a sudden you get the conscious thing like, oh, I have the desire to move now. And then you move, right? But this was already happening unconsciously. And with using more modern techniques, people using fMRI, they can say to a person, look at brain activation and just press the left or the right button whenever you want. And by looking at the buildup of brain activation, they can predict which person the person's going to press, left or right, up to 10 seconds before the person is even consciously aware of their intention. It's pretty dramatic. So I often say we don't have free will, but maybe our unconscious has free will, our unconscious brain. We just are the last to know about it. And then some people tried to save free will. I mean, this is very controversial. So they said, well, maybe we have free won't. Maybe in this moment between when we have the intention and we make the action, there's a few, there's about 20 milliseconds there, we have the capacity to stop the movement. But then more recent study showed when they looked at brain activation building up to the inhibition of a movement, there also was an unconscious kind of building up to that as well. So it's just, there's no way to get out of it. It's just, it is what it is. But, then people say, okay, well, first of all, studies show that if you tell people that they don't have free will and then you give them exams and tests after, they're more likely to act more unethically and to cheat on an exam. So the fact that we evolved to have the feeling of agency and free will is important, evolutionarily speaking. we call it like the illusion of free will. It means something to have that feeling, and it evolved for a reason. But then people say, okay, great, well then can I just go out and commit a crime because I don't have, and just say my brain made me do it, because there's no such thing as free will? Well, not necessarily, because even though we don't have free will in the Cartesian sense, in the sort of more philosophical sense, we do have the capacity to have self-control, right? And the law holds us responsible for our actions to the degree that we have the capacity to have self-control, right? We've evolved it. Other animals have some control as well, but we have this big prefrontal cortex, which gives us the capacity. But that's why there are different judicial consequences depending on your age, because the prefrontal cortex, that brake system that allows us to have self-control, isn't fully evolved, isn't fully mature, until around in your mid-20s. So this is looking at the maturity of the prefrontal cortex. As it gets more blue and dark, it's more mature. So a 5-year-old has less capacity to have self-control. So if they commit a crime, we hold them less responsible for their actions than we do a fully grown adult. So from a neuroscientific perspective, none of these brains have free will, but they have different degrees of the capacity to have self-control. And the other thing is that people possess individual differences on their capacity to have self-control. So this is this classic marshmallow test study, and it's a bit controversial. This was done by Walter Mischel, who just recently passed away, a professor at Columbia. And he said to these kids, they were between the ages of 3 and 6, you can either have 1 marshmallow now, or you can wait and have 2 later. And then he just videoed them, left them in the room with the 1 marshmallow, saw what they would do. So as you can see, some people had a lot more trouble than others who could just just waiting. And what they did is they tracked these kids. This was done in the 1960s, and they looked at them all through life, and they found that those who were able to not eat the 1 marshmallow had more self-control, had better life turnout in terms of like job attainment, marital status, SAT scores, body mass index, all of these things. And everyone's like, well, why is that? But I really think that this is a test of prefrontal cortex function, right? And so it's about how mature is your prefrontal cortex at that early age, and then that leads into all these other things, like, I'm not going to go out to the party tonight, I'm going to stay home and study, right? All these other things that will then lead to better test scores and better job attainment and all the rest of it. But these kids, it's not necessarily all bad to lack impulse control, because children tend to be more creative, right? Because there's not all of this regulation, right? The prefrontal cortex is like telling you, okay, that behavior is not socially appropriate, that's out of context, whatever, everything should be in line. Children, there's less inhibition, but there's also more creativity. Anything goes. And so I got very interested in what are ways, because I think it's very therapeutic if we can temporarily turn down the prefrontal cortex and all that kind of suppression to reach the unconscious and bring it to the surface. It can be very therapeutic. And how can I get people into these brain states? Well, one thing I started thinking about is creativity. When people are being creative, when they're especially being spontaneously creative, when they're improvising, is this a way that we can kind of release that constant suppression and gain access to some of the unconscious processes? So I started looking into the creative arts when people are creating, in particular, freestyle rap. Now that's a transition. But because it's sort of like Freud's free association, right? When Freud's saying just think of anything, right? The first word that comes to your mind, there's no time to think, there's no time to suppress. You can access stuff in the unconscious. And so this freestyle is kind of like that, because it's pretty complex. It has to rhyme, it has to stay on beat, you don't have time to think. It's kind of like, I don't know, I used to play this game when I was a kid in camp when it'd be like, concentration, are you ready? If so, let's go. I don't know if you know, starting with names of girls, and you had to just go, and if you were off the beat, you're out. So you don't have time to think. And freestyle is like that. So I'm gonna show you a little example of it so you can get the idea, and then I'll talk a little bit about the neuroscience behind it, because it's pretty new and novel stuff, but I think it's super interesting. So I'm gonna show you a sample of a freestyle rap. First, he's gonna do a memorized rap, and then he switches into the freestyle so you can see the difference and see how it might be a way to access the unconscious. So I'm gonna play it now. You didn't think you'd be hearing rap today, did you? It's New York, all right, here we go.
performance, feedback, revision. See, the genes are like a text with 100,000 pages, and revisions occur in the random changes that come from mutations. And when they see the light, that's the performance. That's the phenotype. And natural selection, well, that's the feedback side. That's about who survives and whose genes catch rise in the next generation. Yes, what I'm saying is that a rap performance like this is the best illustration for the way that descent with modification works. Because the performance is necessary to change the words, to decide which have an impact and which to send back to the drawing board. In fact, I just did that when you failed to react. Because any line can change, and mutations occur when I improvise on stage. Because up until this moment, everything I said was off the page. But now it's time for me to switch it up and do a little freestyle section. I'm gonna try to make it specific so that I can beat your cheater detection. Yes, I might be a bit of a tough act to follow at the Hammersmith Apollo. That's why the interval's next. But I'm a massive apostle of science. Yeah, that's the way that it goes with these craziest flows. This is me just improvising, trying to say what I know. And when I make a mistake, that just is me rocking the rhythm and trying to introduce a little bit of mutation into the system. I might just come with these freestyle cipher and flows. Simon Singh found some nice stuff in my rhymes with the Bible code. He's been analyzing them, I've been jumping them out and surprising them, but you know, I'm kind of the best at this. I'm not a geneticist, but I kind of understand the things that they've been expressing, like every human being on this planet is relatives, which means every relationship is relatively incestuous, which this couple demonstrates. Nice one, excellent. Yes, indeed, this is the way that I'm rocking the rhythm. This is what you call agnosticism, rationalism. But man, all of these critics have been pissing off Robin Ince talking about, ooh, godless liberals. Well, come on, there's more to godless liberals than that. We got quantum physics and we got ideas about evolutionary altruism. Okay, and some people might try to say that, wait, humanism is the new religion, but it's not, because our ideas are open to revision. See, that's the difference right here. I'm trying to speak this stuff clear, and if you like that idea, then you can make some noise back at me. I'm just trying to scream it out with a lot of audacity. Yes, science does figure things out, actually. But this is my little concept. It's kind of simplistic. It goes like this: performance, feedback, revision. So if you want to know about evolution, this is the definition. Like this: performance, feedback, revision. And if you want to check it out again, I got CDs. You can get them. Like this: performance, feedback, revision. So anybody here can use this concept to learn how to do anything if you want. Performance, feedback, revision. So say it with me: performance, feedback, revision. Thank you.
Yeah, rap. All right. So, interesting, right? You can see the difference, right? This freestyle, this flow, like how does he do that? What's going on? I got very curious. So I got him into my fMRI machine. His name is Baba Brinkman. He's a science rapper, which is a unique genre in itself, I guess. There's not a lot out there. A small plug, he's actually performing off-Broadway right now a show called The Rap Guide to Consciousness, which is all about neuroscience of consciousness in rap. I was the advisor on the show. And full disclosure, he's my husband. So that's how I got him in the scanner. Like, I got to get you in there. So I had him go in there and do a memorized rap and then do a freestyle rap so I can look at the difference in brain activation between these two conditions. And the first thing my lab assistant noticed was two rather disturbing holes. I don't know if you can see them right here in his socks. Do you see that? Yeah. I know. We weren't married yet. I thought he was trying to impress me, but I don't know what that was about. So I got him in there, and basically the way we knew the freestyle, we would just flash different images while he was in the scanner that he could see, and he would have to incorporate that into the rap. So we knew it was totally free and it wasn't from memorized. And then these are actually images of his brain. He has a nice, healthy prefrontal cortex, which I like. Big. It's not that size matters, but it's good. And actually, this part right here, though, is missing. There, you can see. And that's the part of the brain that has to do with listening. It's completely, that's a joke. If you're married, you know. It's completely gone. Yeah, that husband's like, what? What'd she say? It's just like my, yeah. So this was based on some preliminary data on a group of rappers who got in the scanner and did this. And what was found is that during the freestyle phase versus the memorized condition, there was a unique pattern of brain activation. So you had decreased activation here in these areas in blue, specifically in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. And if you remember from before, that's the part of the brain that had increased activation when you were suppressing memories and emotions, right? But in this state, it's decreased. And that's also the part of your brain that has to do with conforming your behavior to make sure, like molding your behavior to make sure it conforms with social norms. It also has to do with it's like our inner critic and our sense of agency. So when people are in these freestyle or like flow states, they often say it feels like it's coming through them from somewhere else, right? Because they don't feel like their sense of self is a bit dissolved. You lose your sense of self. And also, the filter system is turned down, so anything goes. And it allows for creativity because it allows for these novel associations between ideas to be made, because the filter is turned down, the inner critic is turned down. The minute you become too self-aware or too self-conscious, you lose that flow state, right? And they also had increased activation in the medial prefrontal cortex, and that has to do with the internal generation of ideas. So the ideas are coming from within, but they're not being suppressed. So again, that allows for some novelty. But it's not just with this, any kind of flow state, even if you're in the middle of like playing a game of tennis, let's say, or rock climbing, the minute you start to kind of become too self-aware and think about like, oh, what angle exactly should I hit the ball, whatever, you're gonna lose it. You gotta let go and just let your body kind of do what it knows how to do. And what's also interesting is they did a similar study with jazz improvisers. They had them in the scanner, and they were able to play like a little keyboard while they were laying in the scanner, and they did so kind of awkward, but they did it. And they did a memorized piece and then an improvised piece, and compared the two conditions, and it was a similar pattern of brain activation as the rappers who were doing freestyle, in that they had decreased dorsolateral prefrontal cortex activation and increased medial prefrontal cortex activation. So again, you lose your sense of time and self and place, you get increased internal generation of ideas, and anything goes. You're kind of in the flow state. So I believe that the eminent philosopher Marshall Mathers had it correct. I don't know if you guys know about him, but Eminem, he said you have to lose yourself in the music, the moment you own it. You better never let it go. You only get one shot. Do not miss your chance to blow, because opportunity comes once in a lifetime. That's my rap. Okay. I'm not a rapper. It's just ridiculous that I'm rap. But anyway, he had it right. You have to lose yourself in the moment, right? Let go. And so then I started thinking about, well, what about other types of improvisers? What about comedy improv, right? Are they also in that kind of a flow state? So I looked through the literature, there hasn't been much done with comedians. There was one study that actually looked at what happens in viewers' brains when they're observing comedy. So they actually put people in the scanner and they showed them episodes of The Simpsons and Seinfeld and looked at what happens in their brain when things were funny. And what they found was actually that there's a kind of two-stage process for humor. You have the humor detection phase, where you get activation here in the kind of inferior temporal gyrus in the temporal lobe, which has to do with sort of helps us sort through novel or unexpected information and cross-reference it with what's already stored in memory. So the thing about humor, there's something called the incongruity theory, which says like we find things funny that take us by surprise, right? So you're kind of like going down this path, whatever, and then it takes a sharp turn here, unexpected, and you're like, huh, we find that funny. So, novelty. And then once we detect this humor, then you get activation, this humor appreciation phase, in places like the insula cortex, which has to do with our awareness of our internal body sensations, like that feeling of mirth and the actual like laughter, and the amygdala, which is the emotional center of the brain. So that's the laughter and the feeling good part. And also there are interestingly differences in the way male and female brains respond to humor. I think we all just know that, like, anecdotally, but now we have a test to prove it. So they had men and women in the scanner, and they had to subjectively rate 70 like verbal and nonverbal cartoons as funny or not funny. And then they looked at their brains when things were funny. And what they found was that they were similar in that they both had activation of that temporal occipital junction. Remember, that's that cross-referencing information to kind of detect novelty. And they had activation in this subcortical area, the nucleus accumbens, which has to do with that reward, that feeling of reward, and dopamine. It receives dopamine, which is that kind of rewarding neurochemical. But when you looked further, when things were funny, women had even more activation than men in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which basically means that they're probably spending more time like analyzing the semantic structure of the joke, maybe like picking apart the verbiage, like and whereas men might just find like more like, slapstick is more funny, like women are like more kind of analyzing the jokes. And then they also had more activation in the nucleus accumbens, the pleasure center. What's interesting thing is that we think it has to do with expectations. So women perhaps were not necessarily expecting it to be funny, right? So when it was, they get this huge peak in activation, nucleus accumbens. And when things weren't funny, they were like, okay, that's what I expected, right? No big deal. Men maybe were expecting it to be funny. So when it was, they were like, yep, that's just what I expected. And when it wasn't, they actually get decreased activation. They're like disappointed somehow. So basically, I think the moral here is that women have maybe lower expectations, but when they're met, they're pleasantly surprised and they're very, enthusiastic about it. We can read a lot into this, but anyway, I digress. But the one thing that I was really interested in is what's happening in the comedian's brain when they're creating the humor. And there was only one study I came across which looked at the comedians themselves. And what they did is they gave them these kind of New Yorker cartoons when they were in the scanner. And all they had to do was either come up with a caption for them. And it had to either be a mundane caption, so not funny, or a humorous caption. So an example of a mundane one might be like, don't worry, most couples benefit from some form of therapy. And this humor one, my husband came up with this. I'm sorry, ma'am, we don't yet have a neural implant for total obedience. You'll have to do it the old-fashioned way. But they had to do this on the spot, create something that's funny. It's not that easy. And they did this with both amateur and professional comedians in the scanner. And the first thing they found is that there were some differences between amateurs and professionals. The amateurs actually had more activation when they were trying to come up with the humorous captions in the medial prefrontal cortex. That means it was taking them more sort of cognitive effort to think about and come up with these things. But they found that when they were creating humorous captions, they had more activation, again, in this temporal occipital junction. And remember, that's the part that's active in you when you're appreciating humor, when you're cross-referencing information and you're looking for novelty. So it's kind of like detecting novelty and coming up with novel associations. And then they also had increased activation in the striatum, that pleasure center of the brain. So these are the same parts of the brain that are active in you when you're appreciating the humor. But what was interesting is the order of activation, the temporal order. So in you have the humor appreciation phase. You get the temporal occipital junction. Then you have the humor detection phase first, where you get this activation. Then you have the appreciation, where you get the good feeling in the striatum. But what the comedians had, it was the opposite. First they had the striatal activation, and then they had the temporal occipital junction, which means that they were sort of feeling good that they were about to say something funny, even though before they knew what they were about to say. Somehow, there might be some weird thing where the striatal activation is helping them create something humorous, but all we know is that they're getting pleasure out of it, which could be why these performers, it's like an addiction, right? Because they're getting a fulfillment, a joy out of it, or they just have to get on stage, even if they're not really making it, but to the point of, living in a tiny little, place and not eating and doing whatever they can just so they can get on stage and feel that feeling. So the idea is that, maybe there is this neural pattern of creativity that's happening in the brain, but it's not just, in the arts. We can see a similar pattern of brain activation where you have the decreased dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, increased medial prefrontal in other brain states. So you can see it during certain types of hypnosis, during certain types of daydreaming or meditation or REM sleep. Again, where you lose your sense of self and time and place, you get that decreased activation of prefrontal cortices, and it allows for this information to come up from the unconscious, from these subcortical areas. It's associated with a lack of focus, but with very positive emotions. So people strive to get into these brain states, right? They want to get into these flow states where you lose your sense of self, because anxiety and that inner critic, that's like when the prefrontal cortex is really turned up high. And people with, let's say, obsessive compulsive disorder, they have, it's turned on too much, the prefrontal cortex, where they're going over and over and ruminating and thinking about, right? So turning it down has the opposite effect. It leads to impulsivity and lack of, inhibition. But if you can turn it down just temporarily, it could be very pleasurable and lead to these creative states. It only becomes problematic if you can't turn it back on again, right? Then it's not good to have it turned off all the time, but in certain states, it can be very positive. So the question is, does this sort of neural signature of creativity and improvisation cut across different art forms, right? So can we find this neural pattern in, say, people who are painting, or people who are doing theater improv or comedy improv or even dance improv? And one thing that we're limited by is the technology, right? Because how can you look at dance improv when you're laying in a scanner, right? So there's these, EEG headsets, but they're very cumbersome and they're not naturalistic. But people are creating new technologies now, like wearable imaging technologies that we can kind of use so that people can actually be in action, be doing things in real time, and we can look at what's happening in their brain. But the idea is, if we can identify this neural signature of creativity, can we help people get to these states more easily, stay in these states for longer, allow people to kind of tap into their creative side, or just use it for therapy, which I think is very good. And when people often ask me, like, what can I do to be more creative or whatever, I often say it's about, you have to consciously take in all the information, you have to do the work, right? But then you just have to let it go. Go for a walk, do something else. Let your unconscious kind of work on it, because consciousness has a limited capacity, but the unconscious is virtually limitless. It can do much more calculations on the information. So when I say, just improv, it's not like somebody who's completely untrained who's playing random notes on the piano. First, they have to do all the conscious work and train and learn all the structures and the harmonies and the technique. And only then can you let go and then be really good at terms of improvising, right? Or even my husband with rapping, he didn't just start out freestyling. He had to train and practice and, until he got to the point where he knew the techniques of rap so well that he can then start, work on freestyling. But part of being, I think, is doing the hard work consciously and then letting go and letting your unconscious do the work. And the same thing with a physical activity, tennis, you train, and then let go. Your body knows what to do. I also even use this if I'm going climbing, and then you have to kind of get down the mountain, and it's difficult, and it's taking time, you're going step by step. And then one of my colleagues was with me, we were out hiking, and he said, no, just don't think about it, just run down the mountain. Let your body go, and you'll do better. And I was so hesitant, but I did it, and it actually worked much better. Your body knows where to go and knows how to step. And so if you've trained enough times, I think the best thing you can do is let go to reach your peak performance. So the final thing that I kind of want to bring us to is looking into the kind of future of where things are going with the brain. I think the more that we understand the brain and how it works, and I've been doing it by studying, people with psychiatric and neurological problems, but then moving into the realm, a more sort of positive realm of creativity. But the more we can understand how the brain works, the more it will allow us to influence it in more direct ways. So I'm going to kind of give you a little taste of what's currently achievable with brain-computer interfaces and the ways we're kind of learning how to change ourselves with the push of a button via neural implants. So it's kind of very exciting as we start to merge with technology, and I'll give you kind of a glimpse of what's happening now and where things may move to in the future as this technology develops. So one type of neural implant that we've used is called deep brain stimulation, and it's a common treatment for movement disorders. It's been used for movement disorders for about 20 years now, and now it's starting to be used to treat patients with psychiatric illness more recently. But basically what it is they got these implants into subcortical areas of the brain, that's why it's called deep brain stimulation, into those evolutionarily older parts that I was talking about, like the basal ganglia, that's subcortical. These electrodes that get implanted, and they're connected to a wire that's implanted. It's under the skin, and then it's connected to these battery packs that are implanted under the skin. It's the same technology that was used for pacemakers. And these battery packs basically are controlled by remote control. We can control the amount of stimulation. And there's also 4 different contact points on these electrodes, so you can control sort of a little bit of where it's being stimulated and the amount of stimulation. The patient is awake during surgery. It's considered minimally invasive surgery because you basically, I mean, it's going to sound worse than it is, but so you drill these 2 like little burr holes into the skull, and then you just slip this wire on through. And the thing is, you only have to numb the scalp, because the brain itself, even though it's our center of our pain and whatever, feels no pain itself. You could prod and poke the brain, you're not going to feel any of it. So really, you just have to numb the scalp to get through there. And so the patient, you can talk to them during surgery. It's really amazing. You could be on one side looking inside someone's brain and then go around the other side and talk to them. I find it just amazing every time. So this is what the electrodes look like. It's about 1.3 millimeters. These are the different contact points. This is what it looks like implanted in the brain. You can do it unilaterally, or usually it's bilaterally. And it sounds like it's pretty like, oh man, brain surgery, but it's often a last resort for people after medications stop working, after psychotherapy. They've tried everything, nothing works, and this is kind of a last resort. And for people with psychiatric illness, what they used to do is go in and lesion these parts of the brain, right? When these are illnesses that are so severe, like depression or obsessive compulsive disorder, the person just cannot leave their house. They've tried every medication, every therapy, 20 years, and this is the last resort. And if you think about electric shock therapy, that has been used for many years and has a lot of side effects. It's kind of like, if something's wrong with your computer and you don't know, you're like, oh, I'll just like turn it off and turn it on again, and then somehow rebooting it works. That's kind of like electric shock therapy. It's not very specific. You're just kind of like shocking the whole brain, and hopefully it's rebooting. But like, this is kind of like a more targeted electric shock. It's just like it's targeting a very specific circuit. So it's like if your computer's not working, but you just like open and close a specific application, it's more targeted, and there's less side effects. So, but this is, as I said, been being used for movement disorders for years, things like Parkinson's. And it's pretty amazing, the effects. This is where people with Parkinson's, first they start by medications, but over time the medications start to wear off. And this is the next line of treatment. And I'm going to show you a sample of a patient where as soon as, you can see what happens as soon as they turn the electrodes on.
Okay, so we're here for the initial programming session. You got both sides of the brain put in, bilateral stimulators, and we're here for the initial programming session. This is what it looks like without the medicine and the stimulator. And now we're just going to turn it on. If I can get my fat fingers to hit the button. There we go. See how that feels. How you feel?
Yeah, a lot better.
Yeah. Excellent. Try tapping both your fingers for me. Excellent. All right. Feels pretty good?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, good. Excellent.
So as you can see, it's pretty amazing, right? It's so dramatic when you see it like that. And it really helps a lot of people. And, I'm working at Weill Cornell in the Department of Neurosurgery, and seeing patients, on a weekly basis like this, it's just amazing. So this is what some of the things that it's sort of being used for now and what's in development. But I've been involved in some trials with obsessive compulsive disorder. And again, depending on the disorder that you're treating, the stimulators will be implanted in different targets. They're different targets. So like when you're treating depression, it's going to be in a certain part of the brain. The anterior cingulate is the part that's for depression, and OCD is part of the basal ganglia. So again, these are going to be in different parts of the nervous system depending on what you're treating, but it's being looked at for chronic pain, epilepsy, depression, migraine. So it's this technology. Basically, the limiting factor is our understanding of the neurocircuitry of the brain, right? Because we have to understand the underlying the disorder and what's happening in the brain to know where to implant these electrodes. And we also don't know exactly what it's doing. So, like for instance, when you implant it for OCD, you're implanting it actually in the white matter, in the connectivity, the connections between areas. And is it like stimulating a faulty connection, or is it knocking out a faulty connection, or is it, exactly the mechanism we don't know. The other thing is that there's been some long-term trials looking at psychiatric illness, let's say with depression. So also the stimulator is always on. It's always on, constant. And sometimes it's too high. The person's like, oh, I'm having trouble sleeping, whatever. You have to get it a little bit lower. There's some trials which are looking at turning it off at night. Also in like about every 4 or 5 years, like with people with depression, OCD, the symptoms start coming back. And that's actually when the batteries have died and they have to go in and replace the batteries. And then what they find is that, interestingly, the brain doesn't habituate to it. So as soon as they take it out or the batteries die, the symptoms come right back to where they were before. It's doing something, perhaps suppressing it. It's not curing the depression or the OCD, but it's suppressing something somehow. But the second it's turned off, symptoms come right back to where they were. And this is actually looking at the brain for OCD, the implants, and this is just showing you the difference of where, as before with these severe cases, they'd go in and actually lesion or damage this part of the brain. Whereas now they put these electrodes in and they're reversible, they're adjustable. So there's much less side effects, right? If it doesn't work, you can just sort of take them out. Now, whereas before, now you have like permanent damage in your brain. I'm going to also just show you actually a patient who is in surgery when they first turn on the electrodes. This is a patient. Well, you can see her reaction in this video. This is to treat, I think it was OCD.
Oh, man.
Describe what you're feeling right now.
I feel happy.
So it's pretty amazing, right? And what's interesting is this is being tested in the operating room. They don't tell them when it's turned on or off. So all of a sudden it's turned on, she's smiling, she says she feels happy, then she doesn't know it, they turn them off because they're just testing them out, and she goes right back down to like a flat affect. So again, it's pretty amazing, but it's going from this correlation to direct causation, right? To stimulating the brain directly to manipulate emotions, So be nice to neuroscientists because we have our fingers on the button. But it's obviously this is being used to help people who are in very bad situations, but you can kind of extrapolate and see where this might go to in the future. So these are the implants that I was talking about that are actually stimulating parts of the brain. But there are also these brain-computer interfaces, they're called, or BCIs, which it's a direct communication pathway between the brain and an external device. So in this case, this little electrical grid, you can see, is implanted into the brain, and now it's not stimulating, but it's recording information. Okay, and then this microelectrode array detects brain signals, and then it translates that into a computer, right? Those signals gets translated, and then into instructions for a machine to say, control a robotic arm or another device just by using your thoughts. So you have to kind of like learn a person's brain activation. You have to train it, basically. But so, for example, if you implant this in the motor cortex of the brain, and a patient, let's say, who's lost an arm or something, they can just think about, let's say, moving their left arm, and that signal is then translated to a robotic arm, which will then move accordingly. So they can control a prosthetic limb with their thoughts, which is amazing. And then more recently, this research has been done at Caltech has started to be able to create the technology that can sense information, let's say the arm being touched, and feed that information back into the brain. So you can actually get sensory information back from the prosthetic limb. So you can control it with your thoughts and then actually feel things in that limb. There are also studies which there are patients who are completely paralyzed, right? Quadriplegic, or can't communicate. And with these electrodes, they can think about, let's say, moving a cursor on a screen. And they have like the cursor going over all the letters in the alphabet. And then when they want to click on something, they can think about, say, like closing their left hand, and it will make it click. And they can write out a message with their thoughts. So where they otherwise couldn't communicate, with these neuroprosthetics, they can now communicate. So it's really amazing. So I wanted to show you just this one video of this patient using this technique. Again, it's in the very early stages, but where she could use this for the first time to pick up and drink a cup of coffee using her thoughts. So I'm going to just show you this. It's just amazing when you see it.
In this paper, 2 people with tetraplegia, that is 2 people who were unable to move their arms or their legs in any functionally useful way, were able to control a prosthetic or a robotic arm simply by thinking about the movement of their own paralyzed hand. And they did that using the investigational BrainGate neural interface system. So they thought about using their own arm and hand as though they were reaching out themselves with their own limb, and the robotic arm moved much the way their own arm would have moved. One of the long-standing questions, not only in neuroscience but in neurorehabilitation, is whether the cells in the motor cortex and other parts of the brain, whether they continue to function the same way years after that original injury.
It is possible for people to use their thoughts to control devices, either a computer or a robotic arm. And the way that happens is that we implant a tiny sensor, just about the size of a baby aspirin, just into the surface of the brain, and that sensor pick up the electrical impulses from a bunch of neurons. And each of those little neurons are like radio broadcast towers putting out impulses. And when they get to the outside, a computer translator converts the pattern of pulses into something that is a command.
One of our participants was able to do something that, when all of us saw it for the first time, gave us all pause. She reached out with the robotic arm. She thought about the use of her own hand. She picked up that thermos of coffee, brought it close to her, tilted it towards herself, and sipped the coffee from a straw. And that was the first time in nearly 15 years that she had picked up anything and been able to drink from it solely of her own volition.
There was a moment of true joy, true happiness. I mean, it was beyond the fact that it was an accomplishment, I think an important advance in the entire field of brain-computer interfaces, that it was really a moment where we helped somebody do something that they had wished to do for many years. This is the culmination of more than a decade of work, beginning with science at Brown University, that laid the foundation for all of the translational work that led from monkeys playing video games using their thoughts to humans being able to control a cursor in 2006, to ultimately to today's accomplishments.
This kind of research can only happen when institutions come together and bring together teams of scientists and engineers and physicians to work closely together to create the ultimate device, one that works 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, works perfectly every time, and works for a lifetime. That's where we're all headed, and we still have some distance to get there. But to know that it's possible makes all of us quite encouraged about the future.
So it's pretty, unbelievable when you see that. And, it's not only, the other thing that I want to mention is there are other patients who are in what's called a persistent vegetative state, right? Where they just, they're in a coma, basically. And this is getting more, at the extreme end of things. And now, this isn't for all patients who are in these states, but there are some patients where they did these studies where they looked at their brain activation in the fMRI machine. They were in these, what was, again, called persistent vegetative states. They didn't think they were conscious. And there was a small percentage of them that they basically said this to them when they were in the scanner. Think of walking through your house. And now we know what that neural pattern looks like in a healthy person who we tell, they had healthy people go in the scanner and say, think of walking through your house, and that's a distinct pattern of brain activation. And then they say, now imagine playing tennis, and that's another pattern of brain activation. And what they did to these people in coma is they said that to them, imagine walking through your house, imagine playing tennis, and what they found is that in some cases, there were patients who could reliably respond to that with their thoughts. These were in persistent vegetative states. And then they yoked that to okay, now to answer yes, think about playing tennis. And to answer no, think about walking through your house. And there were some patients who were able to do that. So that brings in a lot of ethical questions, about how we treat certain patients. But again, not everybody in a coma has that capacity, and not everybody has the access to these fMRIs and these experiments. So, basically, these electrodes that I've been talking about, and these neural implants, are kind of like the Model T Ford of what's to come. And as our understanding of the brain increases, so will our ability not only to treat disorders, but also to kind of design cognitive enhancements and brain-computer interfaces that can actually potentially take a healthy brain and increase its processing speed, its memory capacity, modulate our emotions, even decrease our need for sleep, maybe even increase intelligence and creativity. Again, the only thing we're limited by is our understanding of the brain. But now, again, they're being used to treat disorders, but ultimately they will move on for cognitive enhancement. And of course, there's ethical considerations, right? Who can afford to get the neural implants, right? Are they going to be cosmetic like Botox, or are they going to be more like performance enhancing drugs in sports, right? Those who have it are going to have a greater capacity to get into the best schools, get the best jobs, whatever. How are we going to account for that? Will it lead to two classes of citizens, right? Those enhanced and those not enhanced. There are going to be laws against it. What if someone can hack into your neural implants and control your thoughts and behaviors? Again, these are academic debates right now, but they're questions that my children will most likely have to confront at some point. And now Elon Musk recently announced that he's starting this brain-computer interface company called Neuralink, where he's creating these devices called neural lace. This is just a simulation of it. It's not the real thing, but basically it's like a kind of a lace-like structure that can be implanted into the brain, and a mesh, it's thin and it's flexible, that can just be injected and can actually fully integrate with brain cells, kind of making these human cyborg-like things possible. People are working on that now. And so that finally is going to ask questions about what does that mean for us in terms of our identity, right? Our brains are kind of responsible for our sense of self and who we are. And when we start to transform our brains with these neural implants, we start merging with technology that can modulate our behavior and our mood and our thoughts. What is that going to say about what it means to be human as we kind of become these sort of cyborgs? And there's this classic philosophical experiment where it's a thought experiment where, philosophers don't do actual experiments, they're thought experiments. say if you take one neuron and you implant it with a silicon chip that can do the same function as a neuron, right? You'll still be you. Or let's say you implant it in the pain circuit in your brain, and then you take another neuron and replace it with a silicon chip, and another and another. At what point are you still you, right? At what point are you still conscious? We don't know. With neural implants, this is becoming closer and closer to a real scenario. So, but again, these broad kind of ethical and philosophical questions aren't necessarily important to people right now with the current problem that neuroprosthetics can fix. So the technology keeps advancing since it provides these real world benefits for people. But what effect it will have in the future on our sense of self and autonomy and what it means to be human is still open. It's yet to kind of be determined. And you can think ultimately of your brain as like a piece of clay that's being sculpted throughout your life, right? It's kind of, it's clay that our experiences are kind of molding over time. Our genes provide the basic raw material and some preformed contours. But then as we engage with the world and interact with it, our neurons become wired up. And the clay begins to harden over time, right? So you're more malleable when you're younger, over time. But it never hardens completely. So there's always room to change throughout your life. It might become a little harder, less malleable, but you always have the capacity to change. So a baby is born with billions of neurons, with trillions of connections, much more than they actually need. And what happens with maturity and development is they're actually pruned away. So the most salient connections are reinforced and the rest are allowed to wither away. So maybe our identity, or the way we form our identity, is a matter of differentiation, right? It's defining ourselves by what we are not, by what we do and don't reach for. That's just my son there, 6 months old, reaching for. Don't worry, we had the batteries out. It was fine. But it's a process. We were born with way more than we need, and we're kind of defining ourselves as we grow and as we evolve. Until our very last breath, we're evolving, we're changing always. The process is never finished, right? It's never too late. So, the more I kind of learn about the brain, the more I realize how little we understand about the neural basis of consciousness and about unconscious processes, right? We still need to account for all the complex dynamics that occurs between unconscious and conscious thought, right? How much control do we have over that interaction? How does it relate to our sense of free will? Why are certain things suddenly relegated to the unconscious, or things suddenly pop up into consciousness? How does that work? Where is that boundary? We don't understand that quite well. In what circumstances are people able to override their hidden urges or impulses by their force of will or willpower, like quitting smoking or going on a diet or regulating their emotions? What's the neural basis of that? And how does psychotherapy or talk therapy work at the neural level? Why does it work? Why does it help to bring these unconscious things into consciousness? And, ultimately we need an overarching theory of consciousness so I can know, whether a bee has it or a fetus has it or the internet has it. We need to kind of with what the knowledge we have so far, I think it will help if we kind of look inward. So one thing is to kind of bring these unconscious desires into consciousness. Again, that's what psychotherapy tries to do, to try to understand yourself better as much as you can, because again, most of it's happening outside of awareness. But if we can understand our unconscious drives a bit better, maybe we can live more in line with ourselves, which will hopefully ultimately lead to some sort of wisdom, like I think is having experience, knowledge, and good judgment. And when I think about these AI systems that are out there now, and people talk about artificial intelligence, the question I always ask is, okay, they can do a lot of more intelligent things than we can do. I mean, they can do math problems much quicker than we can, a lot of things. So they're more intelligent. But the simplest thing of like feeling an emotion, feeling pain, seeing the color red, they might never have. will they ever really be conscious? That's what matters to me, right? Because if the technology, if my refrigerator, if I get mad and I kick it, that's okay, right? But if it can feel something, then I can't kick it, right? It's not ethical to do that. So, you know, these technologies might be very advanced and whatever, but I can still take my iPhone and, you know, throw it in the garbage, and that's fine. So the fact that we are conscious, that we have feelings, creativity perhaps. Ooh, I feel like the gods have spoken. I think that's something uniquely human, at least, you know, for now. So, you know, I started out studying consciousness for a way for my thoughts to survive my death, which I haven't really found yet, unfortunately. But what I got instead was this feeling of awe that this 3-pound lump of gray matter can give us the ability to ask all of these amazing questions and even attempt to answer them. So the question still remains, how does subjective experience arise out of matter? And, you know, we might never know. I don't know. But at least the technologies that we have today are allowing us to peer even deeper into the brain than anything that even existed when I was 5 years old. So I'm optimistic that maybe the next generation of neuroscientists, maybe some of your children or grandchildren, will finally maybe be able to unlock this great mystery. But this is my 22-month-old son and 4.5-year-old daughter, and the half part is very important. You know, they're still in the very early stages of brain development, and I really enjoy watching them evolve. But it's really exciting to imagine what advances neuroscience will make by the time their prefrontal cortices are fully developed in about 2 decades, and the possibilities of maybe enhancing their mental capacities. Not that they would need it, of course, but I think in the meantime, you know, the recent discoveries in neuroscience are helping us to better understand ourselves as well as to treat disorders of the brain. And I think, you know, what I want to leave you with is that the brain is this phenomenal piece of matter. It's both delicate, you know, easily damaged, but it's also robust. It's impressively able to heal itself. And each of us, regardless of our age or a state of health or development, is still midway through a process of an ongoing process of self-creation, self-discovery, as our brains continue to be shaped by our experiences and, again, guided by our genes and form our identities. So we are all a work in progress until our very last breath. Thank you.